Hello and welcome to Archive West Texas. I'm your host, Gordon Wilkerson. Also in our studio this morning, the man who makes this all happen, our producer, Thomas Dye. We're pleased to welcome Joe McKay as our guest today. Joe's been a stalwart in Lubbock architecture for over 60 years. If you've been in Lubbock for any amount of time, chances are you've enjoyed a facility that Joe and his team have designed. In addition to his professional work, Joe's volunteered countless hours on numerous boards and charities within our community. Joe's also the current McKay family caretaker of a distinctive and unique article of American history. We'll ask him about that later. Joe, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Gordon. Appreciate the invite.
I'm struck by a well-known quote that's attributed to Winston Churchill that says that we shape our buildings and afterwards our building shape us. What drew you to architecture?
That's an interesting story. When I was ninth grade in Amarillo, they had a social studies teacher who had us write a career, something about our future career. And I had no idea what I wanted to do or be. And before I came to Amarillo, I lived in Temple and went over to the A&M football games a lot from Temple to College Station. And there was a A&M player who was an architecture major named Augie Sachs. And so when I got ready to decide what I wanted to write my career notebook on, I thought, well, I'll just write it on architecture since I knew Augie and he was a star player and so forth. So that's how I became an architect. But anyway, it led one thing to another, and I had a mechanical drafting instructor who was also my basketball coach. And instead of having to just draw nuts and bolts like you did in mechanical engineering, he let me design houses during that class. So that kind of tweaked my interest and led me directly into the major in architecture. The other part of that is that I was enrolled at the University of Oklahoma with my best friend who was the catcher on our baseball team. And during the summer, before I went to school, they fired their dean of architecture. And so my father said, well, you need to find someplace else to go. Well, I had three cousins who just moved to Champaign-Urbana, University of Illinois. Their father was the grounds maintenance director. And so I said, well, I'll go visit Illinois. And they had a good reputation for architecture schools. So that's how I ended up going to the University of Illinois and spending 5 years in architecture before I moved back to Amarillo. But
Quite a move for a young man from the High Plains. Tell us about where you were born and a little bit about your family history.
I was born in Miami, Oklahoma, and my father was a eye, ear, nose, and throat specialist, and he had his first practice there in the Panhandle of Oklahoma, and then we actually moved to Washington, D.C., where he did an internship and lived there for a couple of years during the Roosevelt administration, actually, before we ended up moving back to, actually moved to Texarkana from there. And that's where my father was called into service since he was a physician in the Second World War. Ironically, he was the eye, ear, nose, throat physician for Mamie Eisenhower while he was stationed at Brooke Medical there in San Antonio. He went from there overseas and ended up in Okinawa and the invasion of Okinawa, and recalled operating in foxholes with water up to his waist, he said. And I remember reading a book about the Okinawa theater, and it was not a pretty picture.
No.
But he had a slip disc in his back, and they shipped him back actually to Temple, to a VA hospital there in Temple. So we ended up living in Temple during my primary and middle school years before moving to Amarillo.
So you played sports at Amarillo, Amarillo High School, I guess?
Played baseball and basketball, and remember playing against some of the Lubbock High Westerners. There was a big rivalry between Amarillo and Lubbock. In fact, in Amarillo, when I started finding a school to go to, the counselors never mentioned Texas Tech or Oklahoma State. A lot of kids have been going from Amarillo to either of those schools. But they just talked about the University of Texas or the University of Oklahoma or A&M, but only 3 schools they mentioned to you.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's how I ended up in Amarillo. Anyway, Dad went into private practice there with another couple of partners, and so we were there.
And you met your wife in high school, Mary Ann?
Ninth grade when I moved to Amarillo. The story is that she and 2 of her friends said, well, I'll get him first, you get him second, and I'll get him third. And never got back to the first one, so that's how I met Mary Ann. And she, of course, we got married summer after our freshman year. She came to Tech, and I went up to Champaign, and we lived then 4 years in Illinois before we moved back to Amarillo, but graduated.
So what was the experience in Illinois like for a Texas?
It was either cold or hot. And it snowed in November and it never melted off the ground until March. So it was a change of environment. But
But you must have had some great instruction at the University of Illinois.
yeah, it was well recognized. And in fact, we even at one point had a lecture by Frank Lloyd Wright for the architecture school. And he was in his 90s then, so it was the last chance to really hear from somebody who was that well known in architecture. I had a good friend in architecture who was from Memphis, Tennessee, and he and I were kind of the southern boys, and we were both Phi Deltas, pledged Phi Delta Theta. But he had a photographic memory, and he never would study until the day or so before the exam, and he'd read the book. And I thought, I was struggling just to make sure I could make good grades, and here he was just breezing through. But he was a good friend and became actually an architect in St. Louis for the Anheuser-Busch Group and doing their Busch Gardens around the country. And so never know who you're going to meet and what will be their outcome. But
A lot of interesting connections.
yeah.
So you graduated from architecture school, came back to Amarillo. What were you doing in Amarillo then?
Well, I graduated, actually Mary Ann was in Amarillo at that time having our second child, which was Cheryl, our daughter. And so she had already come back to Amarillo to have the baby, and then I was graduating on the 16th of June. And Dad said, well, you're going to stay there and graduate because I've invested a lot into this education. So it worked out well, and the only difference is that Mary Ann was born the night I graduated, and I was out in a nightclub with a couple of guys, fraternity brothers, and got back to my aunt's house, and she says, oh, by the way, you're a new father. So that's how.
Congratulations.
Congratulations. Then I ended up moving, back to Amarillo from there. But
We'll take a quick break here, Joe. When we come back, we'll talk a little bit about your early years in architecture in Lubbock.
okay.
I'd like to remind our listeners that if you have a suggestion for a future guest on Archive West Texas, please email us. We're at info@classical1057.org. Thank you for listening, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to Archive West Texas. Today we're speaking with Joe McKay. In our last segment, we talked about how Joe made his way from Amarillo to Illinois and then back to Amarillo. Let's talk about the phone call that brought you to Lubbock and how you established a career in architecture in Lubbock.
In Amarillo, I was working for an architect who was a solo practitioner named George Washington Short, but weren't getting very much done. And Dad was having to make my paycheck, and I'd pay him back whenever I got paid. But in the meantime, I have a friend who had working for a firm here. He was from Amarillo named Bob Ford, and he was actually a structural engineer. And he called me one day and says, what are you doing? I said, well, I'm just sitting here reading magazines, not talking to salespersons every now and then. He said, well, we've got a project we're getting ready to start here in Lubbock, and we need some architecture draftsman help. And he said it would be the Citizens National Bank building, that they're building a new tower. and we've got the job, Atchison, Atkinson, and Cartwright, and they'd like for you to maybe come interview. And I said, okay, I can come do that. So actually, I drove down here on a Saturday, did an interview with Mr. Atkinson and Atchison, and they offered me a job. And I said, well, I've got a wife and 2 kids back in Amarillo. I'll need to make some arrangements. And they said, well, could you be here Monday? So I said, I can be there Monday. Well, in Amarillo, Dad was anxious to see that I got a good job, so he put me on the bus at 4 a.m. in Amarillo to come to Lubbock. Bob Ford met me at the bus station, which was still, now it's a church building downtown. Picked me up at 6 a.m. and we went to work. Their offices, Atchison, Atkinson, Cartwright offices, were behind the Lubbock National Bank building on the 2nd floor above Sanford Agency at that time. It later became the gas company, Intergas, or whatever it was before then. But anyway, that's where we worked, and that was on May 1st, 1963. Well, I don't know if you remember the Hot Shot Cafe that was down on Main across from the jailhouse.
I do remember that.
But it was where we'd go to lunch most of the time, walk down there and have a bowl of chili or something. Well, I got a call. Of course, you didn't have cell phones then, so someone had to come tell me to call home or call my mother. And Monday was Dad's day off, and he had gone over to Oklahoma State to Stillwater. He had his own plane, had a Bonanza, and to get my sister's clothes and stuff at the end of the semester. And on his takeoff from Stillwater, his plane went down and he was killed. And so that kind of left me in limbo. Mother's back in Amarillo with my brother, and what my other brother was in school at Austin College, and my sister at Oklahoma State. So I had to decide, and I said, well, Dad would have wanted me to be employed and take the job, and so that's what I did, and we moved here probably a couple of weeks after that, at about the middle of May, 1963. Began my work there with BGR and on the Citizens National Bank building, which is interesting to see what comes along,
Yes, I mean, I think everybody knows Citizens Tower now because
Right.
It's City Hall, but you were on the design team that put it together in the first place. I'd say it's been a long time since anybody's built a multi-story office building in downtown Lubbock. There've been a couple built southwest part
Right.
of town. But what was the thinking behind? Was that a time when every bank wanted the biggest presence? What drove that decision, I guess?
I'm not sure what drove the decision to build a high-rise bank building, but obviously they were building offices as well for professionals downtown. Then the lawyers were all want to be near the courthouse, and
I used to go to the dentist in that building. So.
okay, no. I mean, the barbershop was in the basement, and the cafeteria.
But that building had, for its time, it had an underground tunnel system. It had a parking building that was connected.
Correct.
It had the auto bank.
It had another tunnel that went over across the street, which is now LP&L.
Right.
But it was an interesting concept. The building was designed in steel, as a steel frame structure. The firm out of Odessa that was low bidder says, and it was out of the money a little bit, they said if you'll change the design to concrete, cast in place concrete, we can save X number of dollars. Well, that meant we had to redraw the plans. So Mr. Cartwright, who was the structural engineer, and I and Bob Ford went down to Fort Worth to consult or actually work with this firm there who did concrete structures as a primary practice. So we were above the bus station in Fort Worth drawing plans day and night to get the building back out where we could start construction. So that's how we ended up designing the building in the beginning. And
that was for Citizens National Bank at the time.
Yeah, at the time, E.W. Williams was the president of the bank at that time, and he came from First National, I think, to become the president of Citizens National.
Was fascinating, the history of that structure and how it's being used now. And really the redevelopment is a nice addition to downtown.
And it's a shame to see it sit there empty and vacant with, all.
Got a little ugly for a while.
Right, and of course somebody had stripped all the copper out, and it was pretty much a gutted frame, so it wasn't that hard just to start over, and it served its purpose after that, and then for the city to take it off the unoccupied roads and make something out of it makes it a really pretty interesting concept with the police station and the LP&L and the city, and getting a lot of folks back into, and the city court, which is on the other side now.
Yeah.
So,
So after several years with Atkinson and Cartwright, you took a job with Brasher, Goyette, and Rapier.
correct.
Tell me what that meant career-wise for you, and where you began to focus architecturally.
I had approached Atchison Cartwright about possibly becoming an associate or a junior member after I got my license. In architecture, you have 5 years of education back then, and you had to serve 3-year apprenticeship. So my apprenticeship was with AA&C at that time, and so it basically meant they said no, that they were not going to have associates. So I said okay. So I approached Brasher, Goyette, and Rapier, BGR. I knew that they were involved in schools and hospitals and clinics, and so that's where I moved to, and then became an associate partner there after about 6 or 7 years, and been doing schools all over the Panhandle. Then I've worked with Bob Goyette on the beginning design of St. Mary's. Interesting story about that is that site, which is a great site for a hospital, was chosen by Elo Urbanowski, who was the consultant to the sisters at St. Mary's, and of course the landscape design and at Tech, and he actually picked that site out for the diocese to purchase for future use. Well, that's what became St. Mary's. However, it was when the day they had groundbreaking, the next day it rained 4 inches, and that site was underwater. The lake, of course, what people didn't understand was that it was designed to be able to elevate the building above the floodplain. But when you saw water over the site with the batter boards out there, people were questioning the selection of that site. But it turned out to be the right site for what we had there.
That is a beautiful site.
The building obviously was done in phases. The south wings were built first, and first floor was just 1 story. Then there was an addition later, and that's when I became more involved as the primary architect. I'm trying to remember who the head of the St. Mary's was at that time, but Jake, anyway, he had a falling out, I guess, with Bob Goyette, and the two of us decided that I could step in and help. And so that's actually, I opened my own practice then around 1980.
Time for us to take another quick break. When we come back, Joe, we'll take a little deeper dive into your work designing medical facilities in Lubbock. I'd like to remind our listeners that all these episodes of Archive West Texas, including this show, are available on demand on our station app and also on our website at classical1057.org. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Archive West Texas. Today we're speaking with Joe McKay. Joe, we talked a little bit last time about Citizens Tower and your initial work in medical facilities, but the medical part of your practice grew to be pretty significant. You spoke a little bit about the St. Mary's site at, I think of at 24th and Quaker, just north of Maxey Park, and what a beautiful place that turned out to be in terms of a hospital campus. Talk us a little more through that and other medical facilities that you've worked with over the years.
Working with St. Mary's on their second big expansion was to the north. They added 5 more floors to the hospital to double primarily the size of the capacity. It also had the emergency room at first floor level. The site later became the site for the medical office building, which is on the site and is 5 stories, and it faces the lake on one side, and most of those doctors' offices were on the lakeside because they could see the geese come and go in the wintertime, and it was just an unusual place to have a site like that in Lubbock where you were overlooking a lake and a park, and so I worked with a firm out of Memphis, Tennessee, to help design that and build the Joe Arrington Cancer Center at the same time as an attachment to St. Mary's. Later, if you recall, the Methodist Hospital and St. Mary's merged, and out of the merger came Covenant, and after several clinics were designed here in Lubbock under the St. Mary's manicle, the expansion into the region was taken on by Covenant, and clinics were built in various communities around West Texas and eastern New Mexico, one in Eunice, New Mexico, one in Hobbs, and then various locations in the Panhandle in West Texas. I think all told there may have been 7 or 8 clinics that we built, each of them for the particular communities, and they weren't just a cookie cutter. They had certain needs that each of these communities had, and so that's kind of how the clinic started. And then we got involved with designing some of the facilities expansion over at Methodist Hospital site. The ER expansion at the surgeries, that was one I was associate architect on. The other one was the several of the clinics that attached to Methodist at that time, their medical office building, and that was pretty much how those expanded. Now, going back a little bit, I was involved with the UMC development, or then it was Lubbock County Hospital when it was first formed, and that was when I was with BGR, and so that.
I'm trying to remember how that was. It Preston Smith that got the funding for the. I know
for the medical school.
For the medical school.
Yes,
and was there a county hospital before Lubbock
no,
General?
One of the criteria to have a medical school was you had to have a hospital that was associated with the medical school. And that's when the citizens of Lubbock voted to fund a Lubbock County hospital, and that's how it got built. But at the same time, Tech had hired a firm out of Houston to design the medical complex. And the site then was kind of set up where you had the main structure of the medical school, and then you had the plug-in structures for other facilities like the hospital. And so the first phase was finished out in the medical school, and then that hospital was plugged into it. As you can tell, the hospital has outgrown that initial site, and it's expanded several times. I was not involved beyond that first, the building of the first UMC, or the Covenant, or Lubbock County Hospital, as it was first called. And it was set up to be a hospital. It wasn't just a county, like most county general in Chicago, or they were all felt like were underwritten by the community and not necessarily for the practice of patients coming from the community. Well, the first administrator, Dick Durbin, came from Chicago, and he said, now, for this hospital to be successful, it's going to have to stand on its own. It can't just, there's not enough indigents in this panhandle area to sustain a public hospital. So he says it's got to be a private-public relationship where the doctors from the community will practice there as well. And that's what happened, and that's why it's been so successful. And anyway, going back to my involvement in the medical field, it was through the clinics that I really got involved in working with Covenant and working with Charlie Trimble, and he kind of drove most of that development.
This will be the concluding portion of today's segment. Appreciate everyone listening today. If you know someone whose story we should share here on Archive West Texas, please email your suggestions to info@classical1057.org. I'm your host, Gordon Wilkerson. Please join us next time when we'll continue our conversation with Joe McKay on his experiences in Lubbock architecture.